Hi, everyone. I think it's a real honor in many ways to be the last speaker of the sessions, because I get to kind of draw on the previous sessions. And I think this morning was so strong. And I'll start by sort of explaining how I got into the whole UBIG debate. I actually came from a labor organizing background, and I focused through the first part of my career on organizing precarious workers into trade unions, but who were in various ways outside or at the margins of the trade union movement. Initially, immigrant construction workers, then domestic workers, and then I moved to Mozambique, which is where I was born, and I realized that many of the demands that the trade union movement had and that trade union workers had didn't easily translate in a context of widespread informality. And I should say that this was around 2010, 2011. So it was also at the height of the discussions on the formalization of the informal economy. And there'd been this kind of political shift away from trying to extend social protections at the level through work or employer guarantees, and towards thinking again about the state and the role of the state in filling the cracks of social and labor protections in the context of widespread informality. And so for me then, my interest in social protection was really an interest about how can domestic workers under the current regime in the context of Mozambique have access to maternity leave, which someone mentioned, paid sick days, occupational health and safety coverage, pensions, etc. And so then I started working on social protection in Mozambique for the ILO. And it was in this context of grappling with the cracks in the social protection system, and as we spoke about earlier, the historical exclusion of able-bodied adults of working age from publicly funded social protection, that I began to look at the question of universal basic income. And of course, this was happening because as Shireen mentioned, context matters, right? This was happening 10 years after the idea of a BIG had initially been introduced in South Africa in response to unemployment. So while I wasn't in South Africa, there's these kinds of cross-country regional conversations that were happening. This presentation for this particular workshop was an interesting challenge. I became aware of my own bias because, as you'll see from the story I just told, I didn't come into the question of UBI from a feminist point of view, from it being a feminist demand. So we've heard today about wages for housework, and what I'd like to do is kind of take you on a journey of what the kind of arguments are and how those might be different from the kinds of arguments that are made for UBI in the Southern African context, and perhaps what we can learn from the feminist demands that might help to repoliticize the debates around UBI in the contemporary period. And we'll see where we go, but that's the idea. So as has already been mentioned, the Wages for Housework campaign wasn't really about wages, right? It wasn't really about income. It was about disrupting social relations. So one of the readings that I shared is Wages Against Housework, which is what Silvia Federici calls her article, which is a polemical discussion about the Wages for Housework movement. And the arguments, the central arguments were that the reproduction of living labor is critical to processes of capitalist accumulation. The women have borne the brunt of this emotional, physical, sexual work. That there's been a process of socialization that encourages or convinces women to do this housework on the basis of love and thus without payment. And therefore that recognizing that housework is work is the first step towards refusing to undertake it, and therefore transforming social and gender relations, right? So the point isn't in this context, in this argument, what is the level of basic income, or that's not the initial point. The initial point is, what is the kind of political struggle that happens around this demand that allows for a politics of recognition, but a politics that then transfers in some way to a politics of redistribution. And it's interesting. I think that, you know, we've heard these terms a lot, you know, throughout the day, and one of the things that would be interesting is to hear from you on how you think this relationship actually functions between this politics of recognition and redistribution. Here is, you know, one of the campaigns, right? So you see the kinds of posters. Every mother is a working mother. But there's also questions around the history of displacement, you know, connected. So there's a connection between the civil rights movement that happened, the feminist movement, liberation movements that some of these protests then brought together. I think that one of the interesting things about the article, I'll jump to this slide and then go back to the next, is that Federici is quite critical of this idea of the career woman, right? Which is the idea that you can escape housework by becoming part of the labor market, right? So the argument is, on the one hand, it's very difficult to escape housework because housework is both necessary and some of what's involved in social reproductive labor can even be pleasurable. But that also, it often happens at the expense, and Shireen spoke about this earlier, at the expense of racialized working class women, right? And so I have a picture here of Albertina Mondlovo, who's one of the leaders of the Domestic Workers Union in Mozambique, and that was part of a profile that we did actually with WeGo on domestic work in 2012, and this was a photo shoot that we'd organized. It's not actually her working, but you know, there's a contradiction in the feminist movement, which is that where women's liberation was about having access to economic autonomy, if it often came, you know, on the backs of exploitation and exploitation of working class women. And therefore, you know, in the argument that Federici makes, it's really important to actually not ignore housework, but rather to challenge or embrace, you know, the housework and challenge the terms on which it's being undertaken. It's also an interesting argument in terms of challenging this marriage, employment, citizenship nexus, you know. So in a context where many of the social welfare, the whole social welfare system was built around sort of two pillars, which I'll talk a little bit about a little bit later, but one which was social insurance, and then maybe there was social assistance, but where social insurance really predominantly covered men, right? And so your ability to access social welfare, to access social protection, was as a spouse or a survivor's pension. You can still see the remnants of this construction in current social insurance systems. And that this then, the wages for housework demand, aim to break these relationships and to recognize the value of unpaid reproductive labor and to de-link citizenship from employment and marriage. And I think that, you know, there is, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable with the term citizenship because it also carries its own sort of connotations. But it's a term that's often used in a lot of the literature on social welfare. And it helped to do this by allowing people to be economically independent. So I don't know if you recall, but in the first lecture with Alessandra Mezzadri, she was speaking about the movement for UBIG in Italy and in Spain, which is being led by feminists. And in contrast, let's say, to the movements here that are about responding to hunger or unemployment, there it's about women's autonomy, you know? And so thinking about, reflecting what then is different in terms of the outcome and how the kinds of UBIGs that we're pushing for and how we're mobilizing around them. And so Pateman kind of does an update of this argument. And what's interesting, and I found Lynn's question around the productivism of wages for housework very, it's an important question, because I had sort of the same reaction, right? Is your only claim to value then one where you turn unpaid work into work that's equivalent to wages? Pateman is much more ambivalent about that, actually, and argues for a kind of a claim based on citizenship. And if you actually see some of the more recent literature on UBI today, let's say at James Ferguson, that really centers on the idea of a politics of a rightful share. So it's actually in some ways a rejection conceptually of a claim that's based on work and valorization of unpaid care work, and much more around some sort of broader conception of rightful share. And I haven't quite figured out in my mind whether that difference matters, but I did want to point out that there's been a kind of generational difference in how feminists speak about these issues and about the idea of basic income. Now, one of the interesting things about the chapter by Federici that I shared is that in many ways she is responding in that chapter to feminist critiques of the wages for housework movement, right? And some of the caveats that are raised there and that have also been raised in earlier discussions today, and that is reinforced by Pateman, is that of course basic income is only relevant if it actually makes a difference in people's lives. And what's interesting about research that we've done more recently is that you see the way that residual cash transfers actually fail to mobilize movements, right? Because if something is insignificant in your life or is very difficult to access, why on earth would you put in the effort to protect it? So there have been some arguments in the early kind of COVID period, right, where there was a hope that we could expand, use some of these cash transfers as wedges for UBI, and the question of level came up, and there were some that argued it doesn't matter the level, if we can get it in, then we can expand it. But it's between the working classes or emerging rural proletariat and the industrial and rural bourgeoisie who wanted this proletariat to move permanently to the cities and wanted to guarantee labor mobility, right? And so there was an abandonment of work conditionalities on the basis of a right to live. But this alliance lasted for about 20 years before eventually workhouses were introduced. But the point is that the idea of some kind of unconditional, universal-ish cash transfer has existed since the 1700s, at least in Europe. But it was as much a claim, right, by emerging working classes as it was a strategy to facilitate proletarianization. And you see in the US a similar kind of proposal by Thomas Paine in his book Agrarian Justice. There, in response to growing anger at the enclosure of the commons by a settler class that had moved to the US and dispossessed Native Americans, but who then were themselves being dispossessed by the concentration of land and capital. And so that Thomas Paine then suggests some kind of basic income as compensation for expropriation, because he argues no one is born a landlord. Everybody is born with a rightful share to access to land, right? You then have the proposal, again emerge with Milton Friedman, through this idea of a negative income tax, but as an excuse to roll back all sorts of other forms of public provisioning. And then you have Van der Veen and Van Parijs, who in 1980, I think it's actually 1986, not 89, introduced the idea of universal basic income in an article called A Capitalist Road to Communism, where they argue that basic income will lead us to a kind of socialist revolution. This was the period, by the way, and of course context matters, where people were quite, ambivalent about the status socialist projects of the Soviet bloc, right? So people were looking for sort of democratic socialism, and basic income becomes the capitalist road to communism. But they say this will be affordable if you deregulate the labor market and eliminate minimum wages. Right? So even some of the thinkers that are now at the forefront of UBI today as a kind of emancipatory politics had actually there's an other side to the story, and it's a side that enables ongoing processes of proletarianization, dispossession of land, rollback of public services, and deepening exploitation by eliminating labor protections. And so we have to be aware that there is this side of the coin, in as much as it's also been a demand of progressive civil rights movements. Martin Luther King proposed a basic income in his own book around economic policies in response to automation in the United States, the feminist movement, and the labor movement, as happened in South Africa, right, with the proposal for a basic income guarantee. And I think that this contradiction is one that's actually inherent to social policy more generally, right? As Tandika Mkandawire said in his book, social policy is a place of struggle because ultimately it touches on power. And so what that means is that there's a sort of fundamental contradiction where a policy may on one hand represent what working classes, and I use this term very broadly, working people, Issa Shifji would have used, all right, where it represents what they've been able to claim back on one hand, but it also represents what has allowed capitalism to continue to accumulate. And we just have to be mindful of that as we then start to reflect on what basic income may be today. Now, I did want to give you a short kind of version of some key elements of social welfare discussions. But this is by no means comprehensive. But just so that we see what are maybe some of the tenets of underlying debates today. We see what the genealogy of those debates are. So the first thing is that historically, the kind of social welfare systems that developed in the global north differentiated between the labor-constrained, who should be cared for in almhouses, hospitals, and orphanages. So these would be the deserving poor, or as we say in Mozambique, the people that don't have arms to work, right? These are the people that are, that it is socially acceptable for them to receive some kind of state support. Then there were the able-bodied deserving poor, who out of no fault of their own had fallen into misfortune and were willing to undertake work in exchange for relief. Now, what made it be out of no fault of their own was precisely the fact that they were willing to take, some kind of drudgerous wage work in exchange for this relief. And then the able-bodied undeserving poor, who refused to work and should be condemned as vagrants. Now, I've gone back to some of the early kind of 16th century documents of social welfare debates in Europe. And one of the interesting things was that the arguments that Vives and other kind of early proponents of welfare systems made was that if we could introduce some kind of welfare, then we can criminalize these vagrants, right? And there were all sorts of language and conditionalities that were introduced that really reflected the fear of the expropriated, the fear of the exploited and excluded, right? And that's what a lot of these conditionalities are about, because of course social welfare, key element of that is imposing social order, right? And that kind of logic has continued to permeate in northern welfare systems, but as we'll see, it's also a logic that has shaped social welfare systems in much of the global south. Of course, there were exceptions, right? So I already mentioned the Speedham Land Act. I always have difficulty pronouncing Speedham. Does anyone? Yes, that. That established that all should receive a minimum income based on the principle of the right to live. And as I mentioned, initially it was supported by landlords, emerging industrialists, the landless proletariat. Now, the bourgeoisie loved this because they could use the subsidy or the income as a way to compensate low wages. So their view was, we pay into the parish coffers and then we can keep wages low because this is going to compensate low wages. Yeah? But what that meant was that wages were low. And so the working classes that were emerging, the proletariat, refused to take up work. And productivity declined. And in that political context then, the bourgeoisie managed to lobby government to advocate for workhouses instead. And if any of you have read Oliver Twist, then you know how terrible those workhouses were, right? There's this description. These were such terrible places that you would sell everything you owned before you would ever subject yourself to that kind of drudgery. So I'm going to skip over T.H. Marshall, although I think that's very important and that was raised earlier, and go to Esping Anderson, not necessarily because these three regimes of welfare capitalism are so useful for us, and we'll talk about why in a second, but because I think what's important is to recognize that social welfare is a site of contestation, right? And that the kinds of systems that you have in place reflect a sort of differing ideologies in politics about the nature of the problem, the role of the state, and you know, what the ultimate goal is. And so Esping Anderson developed this typology based on the northern experience, where he differentiates between liberal, conservative, and social democratic welfare regimes, and then thinks about, okay, well, what is the emphasis, you know, what actors are seen as relevant in welfare provision, what kinds of benefits are there. He draws on Polanyi, who's also in your bibliography. I have links to all of this text, but to think about questions around commodification and decommodification. The idea being that if you have expansive systems of social welfare, then you have a decommodification of life. In other words, you don't have to sell your labor for wages in order to meet your basic needs. And then what the impact is on social stratification. Of course, across most of Africa, as in much of the colonized world, the majority of people were not included in emerging social welfare systems, right? Because we had a racist labor citizenship regime. Now there's differences in terms of the kinds of benefits or the emergence, the history of the emergence of social welfare, even between South Africa and Mozambique, for instance. So it's not that the nature of proletarianization or the nature of social welfare programs was universal. It's important to look at the specificities, both of the colonial regimes and the countries, etc. But overwhelmingly, the majority of people, majority of Africans on the African continent did not have access to these emerging forms either of social insurance or actually of social assistance. Mozambique was one of the worst, I think. So I was looking at what they provided, what the colonial Portuguese regime provided in terms of social assistance for Africans in the late colonial period, so where there'd already the struggle for liberation had started, and there was some incentive to try to de-racialize for the Englishmen to see, as we say in Portuguese, which means not really doing anything. And they provided in social assistance 264 incidences of assistance, most of them being, very limited. Now, in the post-colonial period, there was, in various countries, right, an attempt to democratize social welfare provisioning. And what's interesting is for countries that became independent in the 60s, 70s, cash transfers were not the thing, right? It was about public services, infrastructure, about quite substantive elements, right? That in some way ensured people a higher level of decommodification. But then you had the structural adjustment programs that the countries like Mozambique went through, and that ultimately led to the underfunding and the rollback of a lot of that kind of social provisioning. So for instance, in the 1980s, at the height of the civil war in Mozambique, you had 8 million people, more than 8 million people, who benefited from the state food subsidy system. System was imperfect. Obviously, it was also a response in the context of war, but you had 8 million people who benefited from that system. That was in the late 80s. In '89, the government then embarked on eliminating that as part of structural adjustment, and instead, pushed by the World Bank, it introduced cash transfers, or a safety net. And guess how many people in 1991 were covered by cash transfers? We had 8 million in the late 80s. Any guesses? 1991? 19, right? 19. So this was not, it's again what we say, it's for the Englishman to see, right? Cash transfers in the context of Mozambique, but this is not a story that's so unique. It's maybe a story that's a bit extreme, because we moved from a socialist system to a sort of market economy, right? But cash transfers in Mozambique were not a progressive thing. They were used to grease the wheels of neoliberalism and to eliminate much more expansive systems of social provisioning, to neutralize internal political opposition within the ruling party and within kind of emerging social forces in Mozambique, but also to kind of be able to market something internationally. Now, over the years, social protection and these cash transfer systems introduced then have continued to grow, and I think there's now about 600,000 households that are covered by them. But if you compare that to the 8 million, which was 2/3 of the population in the 1980s, you see, in fact, what the problem with cash transfers might be. But they continued to become a sort of increasingly important sort of mechanism that was considered effective and efficient as a sort of for inclusive growth, right? And that came from both a concern with rising inequality despite economic growth, so recognition that economic growth does not necessarily lead to a reduction in poverty, and that actually rising inequality can stifle growth, so there was a whole literature around that. There was a literature that started to look, also driven by feminist scholars, at the fact that social insurance systems were not actually providing adequate social protection in the context of widespread informality. There was this whole literature around the efficiency of cash transfers, that you could sidestep the neo-patrimonial state and transfer money directly from whether it's development agencies or the national government into the pockets of the poor, which is still literature that's promoted now. And then, there was also important studies that happened, earlier, including by Drez and Sen, that looked to say, well, actually some level of social protection is affordable at all levels of all stages of economic development, so that even developing countries could introduce some kind of social protection system. But of course, what has emerged are these highly targeted cash transfers that in many ways have reproduced this historic differentiation between the deserving and undeserving poor. And so if you look, this is from the ILO Social Protection Report, and we can see the proportion of the population in Africa versus the world. You see, for instance, that the unemployed, less than 5% of the unemployed on the African continent have some access to social protection coverage. Numbers are also fairly low for other sectors, right? But there is this kind of pension systems, for instance, tend to have the highest coverage, in part also because on the African continent, the proportion of elderly is still quite small. So in Mozambique, for instance, as we started to push for universal comprehensive social protection, we started by looking at the elderly because it was 5% of the population, right? And we thought, okay, this is a strategic group. Once we've developed this as a concept, sort of as an ideal, then we can think about other sectors. Now, and Jayati Ghosh, in her article, which is now, more than 10 years old, but I think is still very relevant, challenges this notion of cash transfers as a magic bullet, right? So it ignores existing relations of power. One of her arguments, it justifies the replacement of more comprehensive forms of public provisioning, which would certainly be the case in Mozambique. And there are some arguments in the presentations made this morning that it's also been the case in this COVID period in South Africa. It doesn't pay any consideration to macroeconomic strategies that might generate more better employment or social services or asset transfers like land reform. And it ultimately abstracts from processes of expropriation, exploitation, and exclusion that underlie capitalist accumulation. So that again, we always end up in this dance. Is this something that it can be transformative, or is it simply entrenching the processes of accumulation that we see today? Now, what's interesting about the South African, Southern African discussions is that they might mention as a benefit, that this is a feminist demand, that it compensates women for doing unpaid care work. They might have some element of that, but that's not actually the framing, right? The idea of universal basic income was really a response to the combined challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, which are structural in nature. And a lot of the debate in the newspapers has been about trying to respond to conservative or right-wing resistance to UBI, right? And so oftentimes we craft our points in ways that are about undermining those critiques rather than necessarily thinking about what is it that we're trying to achieve. What would a feminist progressive agenda for UBI be if there is one, right? And so the kinds of, this question around the nature of unemployment has featured heavily in debates in the media. I think obviously, in the context of South Africa, the patterns of unemployment, poverty, working poverty are deeply racialized and gendered, and also shaped by geography, right? Rural, urban is another one of the differences that we see. And there's been a lot of literature around then the implications of a lack of social welfare, adequate social welfare provisioning in terms of the reproductive squeeze. This is a study that was done by Tandy Matthews, actually, where she was looking at sort of comparing social insurance to social assistance and thinking about the sort of cracks and of UBI as filling the cracks of South Africa's social protection system. Because the kind of argument is that social insurance just does not cover the unemployed. It's not an adequate cover. It only covers 5% of the total number. And this is a combination of labor insecurity, lack of enforcement, informality. And so then you have social assistance, which, South Africa has one of the largest social grants programs on the continent. You have the Ethiopian program, which is also substantial, but is mostly conditional cash transfers, right? But that also reflects high levels of proletarianization with land expropriation, right? And I think that there's a very interesting kind of comparison that I'm now trying to get my head around between South Africa and Mozambique, where Mozambique actually doesn't have the kind of budget to provide social grants, but there's the land. So how does land, I think that discussions around redistribution ultimately have to be discussions that bring together land, labor, and welfare. But obviously, until recently, as already has been mentioned, the social assistance or social grant system largely excluded the unemployed. And that then eroded the value of the other grants, whether it was the child care grant or the pension grant, et cetera. And so then comes in the idea of some kind of UBIG, or really what's been proposed is a sort of unemployment grant, but that it doesn't hinge on past contributions. So it's for people between the ages of 18 and 59, which is the group currently not covered. And the kinds of arguments for it are not just that it fills the cracks in the social assistance system, but that it offers some kind of reservation wage so that workers can then afford to withdraw from work and negotiate better working conditions. I think that was also a way of trying to win over the unions in thinking about this as a sort of strategic area. It avoids the kind of costly selection processes and errors of exclusion. So that was an attempt to also win over those who are interested in the technicalities, right, of what is efficiency. So there's an efficiency argument that's made to UBI. and that it prevents coercion of the unemployed into sort of exploitative conditions like the EPWP, which anyway is quite limited in scope because it's costly to implement, it doesn't meet the standards for decent work, and particularly for women, it means that you then sort of reinforce the multiple burdens of paid and unpaid work. But of course, again, the limits come. I think I've been presenting and then I've gone back, and you can kind of see how the challenges and caveats kind of build on each other, right? The first challenge that has been debated in South Africa is, well, what happens conceptually, right? UBIG, the idea is that everybody has access to kind of a floor, but that changes the focus from equality of outcome, which is a tenet of social policy, to equality of opportunity, right? So is that what we're doing? Is that what we're changing? So that's a question, I guess. I think the other one has been very much about, well, is this actually going to achieve the kinds of advantages? Is it actually going to offer a reservation wage? Is it actually going to fill the cracks of the social protection system? Or is it simply going to be so residual that it won't really matter? Is it going to be used to justify the rollback of other forms of public services and kind of grease the wheels of further commodification? Is it actually going to transform social relations, gender relations? Or is it actually going to reproduce, right, these oppressive gender division of labor? Will it actually lead to struggles around decommodification? Or will it simply peter out as people get frustrated with its implementation and figure that it's not actually a worthwhile struggle? There's some really interesting research that's starting to emerge. So my colleague Hannah Dawson has been looking at the case of South Africa. I've been looking at the case of Mozambique, of sort of what are people's hopes and aspirations, those who are unemployed, right, about something like a UBIG. And what we need to do is that we need to get rid of this kind of false consciousness that is preventing people from imagining a world, a post-work utopia. This is the Andre Gores, et cetera. There was a big debate around this kind of language. When I actually went to do research among unemployed in Mozambique, it wasn't that there was necessarily an attachment to the dogma of the dignity of wage work. Actually, people quit work all the time. You take up a job when you need one. Mozambique is a low-wage economy. You know that you have some land. You quit. You go to the next thing. There didn't seem to be an attachment to wage work necessarily. What there was deep skepticism about the state and about kind of putting all of your eggs in the state basket, seeing the state as the provider of your livelihood, right? That was one of the issues. And I think that this is, I mean, there's many, so we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A, but I think that we do have to take seriously why it is that UBI hasn't actually captured the imagination of so many social forces, or to understand where it has and where it hasn't, and to think about where is it that actually struggles are taking place, and why. And obviously the other thing that is also discussed is that it risks sort of reinforcing the kind of unequal structures of ownership. So if you look at the case of South Africa, for instance, you have high levels of market concentration. The retail sector has benefited tremendously from the social grants. Is this actually going to change the structures of ownership in South Africa that are at the root of inequality in this country? So, this is a sort of undecided notes, and I hope that we can have some discussion about this. But I think some of the points that maybe I want to raise, one is that social welfare historically has had this contradictory role as a secondary and supportive institution to capitalist accumulation. That universal basic income is neither inherently good or bad, and is the site of contestation, and I think Shidi said generally the state itself is a site of contestation earlier. That resistance among the unemployed, the expropriated and excluded to being rendered surplus, and to this whole language that they are surplus populations, that we need to understand that a little bit better. And that it's important to kind of clarify what the desired outcome of basic income would be. And to think about it as a political demand which can inspire or connect with other struggles in a sort of holistic way. And I think for those of us who are involved in research but also in policy processes, this is sometimes hard to do because you are put under pressure, or you put yourself under pressure to come up with coherent policy proposals, right? You are expected to propose what the level of basic income is. You spend your time thinking about the intricacies of the design and structure of the proposals that are put together. But those are highly exclusionary processes oftentimes. They're processes that happen within small groups of people, the experts, the policymakers. And one of the things I've noticed, and I've been part of a number of policy processes, is as they gain traction, they speed up, they become faster, and you lose your base. And I think that if we go back to the feminist idea of what basic income is, that it's not actually about our ability to have the most technically accurate proposal, which might be impossible to do anyway. I think that it's just a reminder not to lose the politics of it. Because at the end of the day, I think that's what's going to take us beyond something that is highly residual. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.